Hello, today we will have an introduction to the topic of scaling up. Our class plan is to start with a definition, then talk about the different types of scaling up, then talk about the pathways to scale, and finally talk about why this doesn't matter, why is scaling up so important. So let's start with the conceptual evolution of scaling up. It's a relatively new concept in economics. It only started in 1995 with a seminal paper by Peter Uven, which is still quoted today in the literature about scaling up. In that paper, Uven spoke about quantitative and functional dimensions of scaling up to different countries, scaling up to different functions. And then in the early 2000s, we had the Millennium Development Goals, which changed completely the focus of scaling up. The World Bank had a Shanghai conference where China was co-chairing, China being one of the most experienced countries in scaling up. And in the conference, many experiences were shared around the world about the best programs for poverty alleviation, including community-based participation and programs such as conditional cash transfers. The idea is that people would hear these different experiences and then scale them up in their country. But there was absolutely no framework to think about how that scaling up would happen, except that by exposing different countries to different experiences. Then there was an opportunity to revisit this through the work that especially Johannes Lind did in Brookings, in which he looked at why scaling up was such a difficult concept, and started really the work of putting a framework around the concept of scaling up. So for me, defining scaling up in terms of its development impact, I really relate to the definition that Chandy, Hosono, Karas, and Lin have in their book about scaling up from Brookings, which is scaling up is reaching a large number of poor people with interventions that transform their lives. This is a very particular definition of scaling up, but one that I think really throws light into the reason that scaling up is so important for Imago. So what are the types of scaling up? If we look at the work of Larry Cooley and Cole in MSI, they talk about three types of scaling up, and I really think this is the best definition that we have in terms of these three types. The first type, the most commonly understood one, is expansion, where an organization will grow within itself, either decentralizing, sometimes with spin-offs, but will really expand from its own core. The examples for this is BRAC, which grew to be a conglomerate over time, but it always had at the center BRAC as sort of the mother company of this conglomerate. It had banks, it had universities, it had health interventions, education, social enterprises, but it all remained under BRAC. Bridgespan is an example of a spin-off which was really financed by Bain and then became much more focused on nonprofit in the US and then in other parts of the world. So the second type of scaling up is replication. This is when a policy is adopted by many, which is the example of conditional cash transfers. There was a very structured way of piloting and finding evidence in both Mexico and Brazil about conditional cash transfers, oportunidades, and Bolsa Familia, and this was then adopted by many other countries across the world. But there's also other cases of replication. For example, is the case of microfinance, where there was a clear understanding of how to solve a market failure problem by collective action, and that business model was adopted and it was promoted through Latin America, Action, and through South Asia with BRAC, Grameen, through all of South Asia. So that's an example of replication. The original company or organization that started it is no longer the one implementing, but is rather developing standards and business models that are then copied and used by other organizations that want to do the same. The third type of scaling up is collaboration, where the branding starts to become further and further away from the original organization. And it's more about partnerships and alliances and networks of people who are looking for something that are common purpose. And then they are much more loosely associated than in the case of replication. Oxfam International is a good example of collaboration. They will go and organize around inequality or around violence with girls, and they will have a campaign through the whole world through this network. The most successful example of collaboration in the US are both the IRRP, which is an organization for retirees, and the NRA in the US. So, what are the pathways to scale? No matter what people say, there are only two pathways to scale. An organization, which is here in the center, has to choose either to go through the market or through the government. It's going to require money and it's going to require capacity. And it can get the money and the capacity from either the market or the government. So, if an organization decides to scale through the market, it will need to find a business model. And we will talk later about how that business model can be found. But only once that business model is found, an organization stops being a startup and becomes a real organization and has that highway in the top that allows it to move by its own revenues and have that as a fuel for growth. An organization in the market is also going to be needing a value chain that has all the elements that it needs in order to be able to go through that highway. And we will talk later about how that value chain is full of breaks and failures and market failures when we talk about developing countries or we talk about the base of the pyramid. So that's one pathway to scale. The other one is to scale to the government. And the government will be either paying for some services of government services that should be provided by the government but instead are provided by this organization, or subsidies in the case of externalities where the difference between the private good and the public good is such that the government requires to pay a subsidy. And also the government provides the organizational capacity. The government is probably one of the most important organizations in terms of its reach. It can go through many different levels of government up to the most small locality. And that is a huge highway for scale. And we see how organizations like BRAC, who have developed programs on primary education, or DOTS for tuberculosis, they experimented, they found a way to solve a problem, and then they scaled through governments. So many people ask, what about donors? Well, donors can help. They can help both in the beginning of the market pathway, or they can help in the beginning of the government innovation. But donors don't really implement. Therefore, they just facilitate. But the real pathway to massive scale is going to be either through market or through government. Determining which is the pathway to scale is very important for our organization. Why? Because that will determine what is the sustainable funding model that the organization is going to be looking for. Is it going to be looking for impact investors who will look for market returns? Or is it going to be looking for government payment for services? Those are very two different routes, and they imply very different visions of what the funding requirements will be. So, those two pathways are filled with roadblocks. Why? First of all, the private sector is the best one at scaling, but it's not really interested in the poor. Why? Because the poor don't have the capacity to pay. Therefore, the markets are not going to be deep enough or broad enough for the private sector to really be interested in scaling. The governments have weak capacity, and usually large organizations find it difficult to innovate, test, fail quickly, continue to innovate, iterate, and then eventually scale. And at the core of the donor models is the issue of scaling up, but donors, as I mentioned, don't implement. Scaling up involves transformational change, and that's why it is such a difficult topic. It's difficult to plan ahead when you don't know exactly what the time frame is going to be involved or what are the different outcomes that you're going to have. It's very important to have an intermediation role where an organization A is pre-scale and organization B is post-scale. They are two very different organizations, and getting from organization A to organization B requires an intermediation role which is outside of the organization, which can actually cut through the many different interest groups and really help that organization to do the internal transformation it needs to reach a different scale. And cost-benefit analysis is not always useful because your cost curves are changing as you scale. So it's a very dynamic process, and that's why it's difficult to think about scaling up, and it's difficult to scale. It is a process challenge, not one single constraint. There's design, there's distribution, looking for supply chain, financing, pricing, and experimenting around that, payment, sales. So it's a whole chain that needs to be discovered. And as Johannes Lind says in the book, the Brooking books about scaling up, little is understood about how to design scalable projects and how to get there. So why does scaling up matter? It matters because there's so many unmet needs at the base of the pyramid. There are huge gaps in the delivery of basic services. There are huge constraints in terms of access, affordability, awareness, acceptability. And the gaps are really huge in terms of numbers, so large that the government alone will not be able to meet all these gaps. We know that there are 1 billion people who cannot obtain the health services needed. 2.5 billion people don't have access to quality sanitation. 780,000 adults don't have reading and writing skills. 1.2 billion people don't have access to electricity. 2.5 billion adults are unbanked. So the gaps are huge, the challenge is enormous, and scale is part of the way to solve this problem. To solve a problem which has to do with the missing middle in development, where we have governments and donors and private sector who know how to do many things well, but who find it difficult for some what we call these wicked development problems to really be resolved when the challenge is not a technical challenge, but it's an adaptive challenge that requires behavioral change and innovation. On the other hand, at the base of this pyramid, there's social entrepreneurs, there are NGOs who are innovating, who are able to bring about these mental shifts and these changes in behavior at the base of the pyramid. But unfortunately, except for BRAC, none of these have been really able to scale in a way that they fill that middle and they connect the top of this triangle with the bottom of it. And that is the question of scale.